The history of Wood Lake with Bob Glancy. How much a lake and its surroundings change in 180 years. You might be surprised when you hear and see about this Richfield gem. Bob Glancy was born in St. Paul, graduated with a bachelor's degree in journalism from Macalester College. He avoided taking classes in history whenever he could. He worked as an editor of business publications for 20 years. He became a realtor in 1980, a long time ago, specializing in selling homes in the Lowry Hill, East Isles, and Cedar Lake neighborhoods. He bought an 1898 house in Lowry Hill, got interested in the house's history, and the door to local history opened up to him. In marketing himself as a neighborhood specialist realty, he produced and distributed 13 annual editions of calendars with historic photos and information about the neighborhoods. It was through his house history research that I got to know Bob. He joined the Linden Hills History Study Group many years ago and has, not in the 1890s, but has been a frequent speaker throughout the years. He has created and conducted many historic walking and bus tours. He served as acting director of Preservation Alliance of Minnesota, on the board of Hennepin History Museum and the Richfield Historical Society. He was a commissioner on the Minneapolis Heritage Preservation Commission. He currently serves on the board of Friends of Wood Lake. And now, Bob, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Joellen. Is this microphone working all right? Good. Let's keep our fingers crossed. Today you'll be learning about 2 centuries of Wood Lake history, but I would like to know what your history with Wood Lake is. Do you remember the first visit you made and what you did? Who had their first experience here more than 20 years ago? More than 30? How many visited here more than 40 years ago? And the final question is, how many of you were here 52 years ago this month when the Nature Center was officially opened? Wow, that's great. My own first experience was a cross-country skiing event on New Year's Eve 45 years ago. My next experience was 12 years ago when my wife and I bought a co-op unit in the Gramercy Park Cooperative right across the street on the 12th floor of that building, I might add. My first introduction to the residents, i.e. critters, of Wood Lake happened the following summer after we moved in, when I looked out my bedroom window to be greeted by this critter, a red-tailed hawk. And a few weeks later, this guy was staring me down before he took flight into the center. Another day, I looked down from my balcony to a Lakeshore Drive and found this parade coming down the street as 50-some geese were out for a morning stroll into the woods. Over the years, I and other Gramercy Park residents have had Wood Lake visitors to our front yard, including a snapping turtle that made it across the street to try to lay its eggs in our boulevard. We also often see cottontail rabbits nibbling on the hostas in our gardens and see an occasional garter snake. One summer, a pair of mallards hatched their young from the nest they built 2 feet from our driveway. Sometimes my day ends when I go to bed and hear the hooting of an owl outside my balcony. Because I've been a neighbor historian in Minneapolis for 50 years, my interest in history of my new Ridgefield neighborhood was a natural. And I began to do research and learn more and more interesting facts and focus my research on Wood Lake. So let's learn more about it. As you know, Minneapolis claims to be the city of lakes, and while Wood Lake isn't part of the city's chain of lakes, it does claim the same birthrights. Wood Lake was born about the same time as Cedar Lake, Lake of the Isles, Baday-Makaska, and Lake Harriet, and a whole bunch of others. The birth occurred about 12,000 years ago, when the last of the glaciers were receding northward across Minnesota and leaving behind depressions in the landscape that filled with water. The Mississippi River also played a role in their creation when its path was located in this area before it migrated to the east. When a federal military outpost was established at the confluence of the Mississippi and Minnesota, then called St. Peter's Rivers, in 1805, the western boundary of it ran through Wood Lake and what we now know as Richfield Lake. It's the diagonal line in the lower left corner, running through running through the corner. And if this was 1805, you would be sitting outside of the reservation. If you were having lunch at the VFW dining room, you would be inside the reservation. So, this is probably the first map, or the oldest map that we're aware of, that shows Wood Lake on it. A closer look reveals that in 1835, it was called Lake of the Woods. It was, it was changed to Wood Lake by 1854, and you may want to make note of the lake immediately north of Wood Lake on the map, labeled Grass Lake. Grass Lake was known, which we know today as Richfield Lake. Also note that the shaded area was an oak forest, which explains why the lake got its name, Wood Lake. And its Lake of the Woods name and its current name. By 1854, most of what was still the Minnesota Territory before it became a state had been surveyed into townships which contained 36 one-square-mile sections of land, and the surveys became maps like this. If we look at the bottom of the map, we find Wood Lake and Grass Lake. And as you will see on some other maps, both Grass Lake and Wood Lake have shrunk a lot over the years. And the southeast part of Grass Lake became, as I say, today's Richfield Lake. If we zoom in, we see that the two lakes were separated by a strip of land. It was only about 400 feet wide. This is where 66th Street runs today. The two lakes may have been thought of as twin lakes or even conjoined twins because there was a creek that ran between them, and there was a beaver dam on that creek. To give you an idea of how much Wood Lake has shrunk since 1854, if you were sitting here in that year, you would be completely underwater. And if you started to swim north, you would have to swim long blocks, a long city block, before you could walk up on the shore. In 1852, Riley Bartholomew came from Ohio and moved into his first residence, a tent, on the shore of Wood Lake. By the following year, Bartholomew had built a two-story house on his land, and he then purchased two one-story buildings near Minnehaha Falls and moved them in the middle of the winter and attached them to his original two-story house. The Bartholomews were the first family to have a home overlooking Wood Lake. This is the house today on the corner of Lindale Avenue and 69th Street. It was placed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1978. It is owned by the Richfield Historical Society, which has its offices and museum next door. You can tour the house between May and October of each year. By 1879, lots of people had discovered the Wood Lake area. This map from that era shows that almost every parcel of land around the lake had a private owner. And the small squares on the map indicate how few houses or other buildings had been built by that time. By the 1920s, the land near Wood Lake was platted into blocks and lots, and it was appealing to buyers for home sites. Here's an ad for lots that became the block right across the street, across Lakeshore Drive from Wood Lake. And from an enticing brochure that the realtors put out to sell lots, we learned that I will read part of the glowing merits of the lots. Fairwood Shores, the last word in home development. Located on famous Lindale Avenue South and West 66th Street, the most beautiful wooded lake property ever subdivided into residential sites. Building restrictions are $4,000, no stores or duplexes, making the logical place for the year-round home.
What year was that?
This was in the 1920s. Don't forget, they're paving Lindale Avenue, so you will have no dust.
What is Linden Avenue?
What is Lindale Avenue? It's the next street that way. It runs down the east side of the Nature Center. Large quarter-acre lots, $495 and up. Lakeshore lots, higher. Terms, $100 cash, $10 per month, interest 6%. Here's how the lots were platted on the block across the street, across Lakeshore Drive. And note that there was originally a street that ran through the middle of that block called Graham Avenue. 12 houses were built on that block. And on Graham Avenue, as well as 5 or 6 houses that face Lakeshore Drive. And all of these were moved out of Richfield in 1980 to make room to build Lakeshore Drive condominiums, the 16-story high-rise on the block. Another nearby development was Wood Lake Highlands at Lindale Avenue and 67th. Or maybe you would rather live a little further from a busy intersection. Then try Lindale Shores on Wood Lake. Beautiful home sites among the oaks. on the shore of Wood Lake. The center photo in the brochure, the caption reads, "Night or day, it is beautiful on Wood Lake." Many ads bragged of the abundance of oak trees. Today, the oaks near the lake have all pretty much disappeared, but from this 1913 photo, there actually were a lot of oak trees, and it was, and note the lake in the right side of the photo, the light area. That's the lake showing through the woods. The real estate agents didn't have to exaggerate about the beauty of Wood Lake. It was clear and deeper than today. There were reminders, of course, that you weren't far from the city. On the south shore of the lake, you might catch a view of Richfield's world-famous resident. This is Duchess Skylark Ormsby. Duchess was the world's champion cow for delivering milk with the highest butterfat content. She was owned by John Irwin, who introduced Guernsey cattle to Minnesota. The farm was on the south shore of the lake, as I say, and no doubt Duchess drank from the lake. You don't suppose it was something in the water that led to her setting the world record. John Irwin was also president of Augsburg College, which had plans to build a new campus nearby and move the college from the Riverside neighborhood, where it still is in Minneapolis. The farm was platted into lots for building, also in the 1920s. As long as most of us can remember, the only thing you could do with Wood Lake was look at it, take pictures, or walk on the nearby paths that were created 52 years ago when the Nature Center was opened. But since the first settlers moved to the area, the lake has provided a site for more than a dozen activities. Here's one that you probably wouldn't think of. As early as 1870, there was a Baptist church at 65th Street in Lindale. The pastor of that church used Wood Lake as a place to perform baptisms. One of the most practical uses the lake served was as a source of ice to keep the food in your ice box cold in the summer. Nearby, residents built an ice house near the lake where they could store the ice blocks separated by layers of sawdust to insulate them and keep them from freezing together. But most of the activities on the lake were recreational. An early activity was ice skating, naturally, and this continued to be a popular winter form of recreation as recently as the 1960s. That was when the cattail started to take over, and it wasn't very easy to skate. By then, there was a warming shed for skaters, but as the sign on the roof says, positively no swimming. The sign may have been meant to discourage people from wading into the water and finding themselves up to their waists in muck. And just a few feet from the ice skating, kids could go sledding. Naturally, neighbors who had a sleigh and horses could take a jaunt around Wood Lake throughout the winter. In the 1920s, Richfield residents would go to Wood Lake to watch salty races on the ice. This was also down Lake of the Isles, by the way. The horses were given extra traction by a local blacksmith who applied a layer of cork to their hooves. And if being pulled around Wood Lake by a horse wasn't exciting enough, you could choose ice boat racing. In 1943, a newspaper story reported that Richfield resident Rudy Bozer had taken a few spins around Wood Lake in his motorboat. It was thought that Rudy's was the first motorboat seen on the lake in 15 years. It was probably the last. In the late 40s, a Richfield police officer who was parked near the lake saw a pontoon plane land on the lake. The pilot apparently also saw the patrol officer because he immediately turned around and took off. Hunting for ducks and geese, of course, was done on the lake until the town passed a law prohibiting it. In a file at the Richfield Historical Society, a neighbor of Wood Lake was quoted as saying they had seen more than 2,000 ducks on Wood Lake at one time. I assume it was during migration. Ducks and geese weren't the only wildlife hunted here. When the lake site became dry land during a drought period, the Bloomington Richfield Sportsman's Club held a fox hunt. One of the members of the club plowed the tall grass down in the lake bottom to create paths for the hunters to gain access. 2 foxes were killed during the hunt. There was fishing, of course, and it was easy to bring home a mess of crappies like this. Wood Lake was known as one of the best lakes for fishing in southern Hennepin County. Spearfishing is still possible, as you can see from this Vera Alcott photo. And both bird watching and photographer watching are possible at Wood Lake, as you can see in this other Vera Alcott photo. Today, the predominant species of fish in the lake is goldfish. Goldfish that were released into the lake by children, mainly, who thought it was the best alternative when they got tired of taking care of their goldfish in their bowl at home. One of the lesser-known activities that was offered at the Nature Center was spelunking, or cave exploring. A Star Tribune article dated September 17, 1981 read, quote, "One activity the Nature Center offers to groups is spelunking, cave exploring. Since Richfield has no real caves, the center makes do with huge storm sewer pipes opening on Wood Lake. Curious Cub Scouts with their brave leaders venture into the system to see and hear not dripping stalactites and the flutter of bats, but the underside of manhole covers." But the most popular activities since the Nature Center was created are cross-country skiing, walking, and photography. And one of the most talented nature photographers is Vera Alcott, who lives in Gramercy Park, where I do. When Vera moved to Gramercy Park Cooperative across the street, she immediately fell in love with the Nature Center and would spend dozens of hours every week capturing hundreds of photos of its flora and fauna. Here's a small sampling of the photos that have made her the area's most recognized nature photographer. I think you would have to agree Vera is very talented with a camera. The Nature Center has a program for tracking the number of species of birds observed here, and you can find a display in the hallway as you leave that lets you write down what bird species you have seen. At last count, 230 species of birds have been identified in Wood Lake. Now I'd like to take you on a whirlwind trip through history and the history of Wood Lake. Wood Lake's twin sister, Grass Lake, seen at the top of this 1870s map, went through a dramatic and almost constant shrinking since the earliest known maps were made by soldiers at Fort Snelling. There weren't any exciting physical changes to Wood Lake until the late 1920s, except for the occasional shrinking and refilling of both Wood Lake and Grass Lake. This graph shows a history of lake level changes. The first dramatic shrinking of the lake started about 1850 and continued until about 1870. The lake levels then rose again gradually until about 1910, when it began another fall for 20 years into the Dust Bowl years of the 1930s, when most of the country was in a state of drought. In the late 1920s, when Wood Lake had totally dried out, there was a proposal to connect short segments of Lakeshore Drive into a continuous drive around the entire lake. Eventually, the lake filled again, and some of that land where the road was going to be was no longer pavable, and that project never happened. Curiously, all three of those sections that are still there are called Lakeshore Drive South, including the one on the north end of the lake. After the lake refilled, a bathing beach was created on the north shore where we are now, and the Nature Center, where the Nature Center building now stands. On the northwest corner, just over here, there was a park called Grant Park. A Richfield resident recalled driving cattle through Wood Lake in 1929. Another told of walking through the lake when cottonwood trees were growing in it. Gunnar Ahlquist lived near the lake in 1932 and wrote that he walked through the lake that year and said that the weeds in the lake were 6 feet high and that there was a grove of poplar trees in the middle. Ahlquist reported that Hennepin County engineers determined that in 1941, the silt on the bottom of the lake in one area was more than 19 feet deep. A news article in the Minneapolis Journal on May 1st of 1927 said that Richfield was planning to raise the water level of Wood Lake. It said that village officials estimated it would put 4 feet of water in the bed that was almost dry. They said that a new pump would put 1,000 gallons of water into the lake per minute, and that it would take 1 million gallons to raise the lake level 1 inch. The well was completed in 1929. In 9 of the 10 years between 1929 and 1938, rainfall in Richfield was less than average. This 1937 aerial photo shows that the only areas near Wood Lake that were platted into blocks and lots for development were those where groves of oak trees grew near Wood Lake. In the next 3 years, several homes had been built in these areas, and the areas that were clear of trees were naturally still used for farmland. You might also note that at the top of the center of the photo, Grass Lake has already shrunk to the point that it has become 2 lakes, sort of like an amoeba dividing. In the middle section, where it used to be water, now has streets that have been put in and paved. Today, this is the spaghetti bowl of the intersection of I-35 and W and Highway 62. This 1940 aerial photo shows areas adjacent to Grass and Wood Lakes beginning to look like neighborhoods, with lake levels back to pre-Dust Bowl levels. The distance between the lakes is still only 500 or 600 feet. Again, if you were standing here in 1940, you might be up to your waist in Wood Lake. The next year, the area west of the lakes would get a new addition, the relocation of Highway 65. Note the red vertical line immediately west of Wood Lake. That is Humboldt Avenue South. A year later, it would become Highway 65. Lyndale Avenue had been Highway 65 for decades when the State Highway Department decided it should become a 4-lane highway through Richfield west of Grass and Wood Lakes. This aerial photo, looking south, shows that the route chosen diverted the highway at 56th Street, where it took a southwest path to Fremont Avenue first, and then jogged over to Humboldt Avenue to get around Wood Lake, and then followed the former Humboldt Avenue south to the Minnesota River, where it rejoined its original highway path south. Note that the road running east-west through the middle of the map is 62nd Street. It would later become Crosstown Highway 62. The road at the top was Highway 100 or West 78th Street. It became Interstate I-494. Fast forward 15 years and looking at the area from the south, and you see a clover leaf where the new 35W and I-494 cross, and where Highway 62 crosses 35W. You see a spaghetti bowl of highways and ramps on what was once the middle of Grass Lake. This 1945 map illustrates how the village of Richfield planned to keep the level of all of its lakes higher by turning them all into holding ponds of rainwater runoff. And in the upper left-hand corner, you see that Grass Lake had shrunk to the point of becoming 2 lakes, and that the lower part was later named Richfield Lake. The plan was to turn the upper part of the former Grass Lake into a reservoir to store sewer runoff, sanitary sewer runoff, and connect it by underground pipes to the other Richfield lakes. When the lake levels began to exceed the wanted levels, excess water would flow through the pipes to the Mississippi River. The pipes can handle about 2 inches of rainfall in 24 hours. If more than that falls, the ponds hold the water until the pipes can take it to the river. Runoff water from freeways adjacent to Wood Lake contain salt from winter de-icing, and through the years, Richfield has practiced a little land use alchemy, turning what was a swamp into the Wood Lake Nature Center. Wood Lake got a new neighbor when the Richfield VFW post built its new headquarters on the corner of Linden and Lakeshore Drive at the end of World War II. One of the public services the VFW co-sponsored with a local Cub Scout troop was an annual Christmas tree burning event. And where did they have it? In the middle of Wood Lake. All Richfield residents could bring their tree after Christmas to Wood Lake and then gather on the shore a week after Christmas to witness the biggest double whammy pollution event of the year. On the same night, the city's air would be polluted with smoke, and the lake would be polluted with ashes. What could be more fun than that? In the early 1950s, there were formal skating rinks on this north end of the lake near the shore. I-35W replaced State Highway 65 in the mid-50s. When it did, it raised some interesting questions if you look at this aerial photo. A news story in 1942 said a 2-year-old boy had drowned in Wood Lake at the intersection of Humboldt Avenue South and 69th Street. That's the intersection just to the left or west of 35 in the center. This photo, and yet at that point, it was now west of the interstate and about a block and a half from the shore of the lake. Also, an extension of Humboldt Avenue, you see at the bottom center, was still labeled Lakeshore Drive, even though it had a freeway between it and the lake. Interest in creating a nature center in Richfield got its start in the early 1960s. At a meeting of the Minnesota Valley Women's Club in 1962, a motion was passed to adopt a continuing project, the beautification, development, and restoration of Wood Lake, and to interest other civic and government groups in this endeavor. The lake was almost totally covered with vegetation in the early 1960s. By the fall of 1966, some residents were becoming tired of watching the north shore of the Wood Lake gradually becoming a dump. There were neighbors who thought there were better uses for the Wood Lake area. One idea was to use it to create an 18-hole golf course that would logically have some large water hazards. There would also be a large ice racing oval, an ice arena, a chipping green, and a driving range. Other neighbors had other ideas on how to use the land and that it should be developed into sites for homes. Some residents thought the area should be left as is and incur no expenses to taxpayers. The controversy raged through the summer and fall of 1966. Here are just a few of the posters and ads created by groups favoring one proposal or another. One of the biggest promoters of restoring the lake and turning the area into a nature center was wildlife photographer Les Blacklock, who was one of the foremost naturalists in the United States. He said years later that he had always been interested in Wood Lake. He said, quote, "I saw it when I was driving into the city and always thought, how great Richfield hasn't made it a dump ground or parking lot." One day, Blacklock took his truck, which he named Goose, to the lake, put on his hip boots, and waded out into the water. He said, quote, "I was standing on a root system 27 feet deep. It was fascinating to bounce up and down and see the vegetation bouncing 40 feet away. I got so excited to see so many species of wildlife that I started to talk to the people who lived around the lake. Someone had seen a golden eagle that stayed in the marsh for 2 weeks. I let my mind go boing and came up with ideas. I presented them to the city council, and when the council bought the idea of a nature center, I was elated," unquote. The lake was rebuilt because, according to Blacklock, the pools in the lake were quite limited and the lake had to be rebuilt. He said, quote, "We had to make as many territories as possible for birds and animals to nest and feed, and for people to be able to see what goes on in a marsh," unquote. North Pole explorer Will Steger was another supporter of Wood Lake being redeveloped. He grew up near the lake and as a boy built rafts out of scrap lumber and sailed them on the lake with his friends. He once said that he doubted if he would have become an Arctic explorer if it hadn't been for his early experiences on Wood Lake. On November 8th, 1966, the residents of Richfield voted on what the city should do with the lake. There were 6 options for what should be done. Of the 12,243 countable ballots cast, about a third, or 4,000, who voted were for lake development. 1,800 were for a golf course. 1,600 were for a community center, and about 1,500 were for an ice arena. 351 were for a ballpark. Coming in second with 2,797 votes was none of the above, or do nothing. The Nature Center had been approved. This plan for the Nature Center appeared in the Minneapolis Star in August of 1968. It shows 2 prairie areas, a lily pond, an open pond area, and surrounding wooded areas. It was estimated that it could be completed by the fall of 1971. It was believed that about 60 acres of the total center would be open water deeper than 5 feet. A 2,000 gallon per minute well was created, and a pump costing $70,000 was installed. It was needed to help keep the lake water level up. However, the city made the center cap off that well in the early 80s because water from the aquifer was needed for use in homes and other buildings. The plans also were for the lake to vary in depth from 6 to 12 feet and for walking and bicycle paths that would be made of blacktop. Those plans obviously changed. This is the plan showing where the buildings and parking lots would go, including a parking area off of Linden Avenue on the left. This lot was later removed and the land was reforested. Two-thirds of the dredging was done in 1968. Also finished that year were the peripheral fencing and the well designed to keep the lake's level maintained. The remainder of the marsh was dredged in 1969. The plan for the Nature Center was approved in November of that year. Also completed in 1969 were an imaginative play environment, peripheral path grading, and a picnic grounds, including a shelter, parking lots, and design planning, permanent for permanent lines for an interpretive center. Rainwater runoff from Linden Avenue created this stream into the lake. The plans were for the lake to vary in depth from 6 to 12 feet, as I mentioned, and for walking and bicycle paths would be made of blacktop. Here are some of the scenes from the construction years. In 1970, the interpretive center was completed. Boardwalks and the floating bridge were built, and the nature trails were finished. In 1971, lighting was installed for the parking areas, and final grading and sloping of the land was done. The final cost of the project was $827,900, of which $205,000 came from Hennepin County, and the rest from profits from Richfield municipal liquor sales. The Nature Center was dedicated May 23rd, 1971, and it soon had average monthly attendance of 6,900. The city had channeled $667,000 into the project, all of it coming from municipal liquor store revenue and none from city taxes. As many of you know who have hiked the Nature Center's trails, you can often spot deer here. Sometimes there are too many deer. Beginning in 1994 and continuing to today, Nature Center has used a trap and dispatch program to keep the number of deer at 5 or fewer as measured in January of each year. It became necessary to keep the center from being overgrazed and all venison from the program is given to charities. In 1996, a connection was made between Wood Lake and Richfield Lake to keep Richfield Lake and the flooding from flooding. Dredging was commenced again. Sediment ponds were created on the edges of the marsh to intercept storm sewer sediment and garbage. In 1997, major flooding from heavy rains swamped trails and threatened the nature center buildings that you are in. Surrounding the building with sandbags saved the day for the buildings, but the trails just had to wait for the water levels to go down. In 1998, more dredging is finally completed after 3 years. The process was aided by mild winters. In 1999, the 1948 VFW building that you saw earlier across Lakeshore Drive was torn down, and a large hole in the ground awaited the construction of Gramercy Park Cooperative, where I live. Here is the building half completed in 2000. In 1999, the sound dampening wall between Highway I-35W and Wood Lake was completed, which made walking on the trails much more peaceful. In 2000, dredge spoil, what's dug up, was used to fill the old picnic area, which is out here, and the Linden Avenue parking lot was removed and reforested. The center received $5,500 in 2017 for a goldfish eradication plan. 150 smallmouth bass were purchased and released into the lake. And as the old saw goes, the big fish ate the little fish. Unfortunately, while the population of the orange invaders did decrease dramatically, but unfortunately the bass didn't survive the following winter due to largely to how shallow the lake is and how deep the ice froze. Some of the money that was given for the program was used to teach people how to properly dispose of unwanted fish. The problem is undergoing further study. In 2020, Nature Center received a Musser grant to restore biodiversity to the forest floor on the east side of the lake. 300 shrubs were planted and seed was sown to grow grasses, sedge, and native flowers. An open area on the south end of the lake is being restored into a prairie and an oak savanna, bringing back the oak trees that were so plentiful around here 200 years ago. In 2021, the Nature Center reopened after having activities limited by the COVID epidemic. Money was received to study possible remedies to the problem of children dumping their fish into the lake. This is the way the lake looked in 2019, the way it had looked basically for many years. And in the next slide, we see a trail map that was based on that photograph. And this photo of the trail map is the kind that you still see in the Nature Center when you go walking. 2 years ago, on May 26th, we had a storm that caused the west end of the floating bridge to detach from its moorings. And my friend at Gramercy Park, Dean Manbeck, noticed that it had happened and began taking photographs. And the next several photos were what he took that showed how the floating bridge became like a whip when the wind was blowing and was floating all over the lake. So I thank him for letting me use his photos in my presentation. These are Dean's photos. That's the end of the bridge, and there's a close-up where it broke loose. It's up against the south shore, I believe, there. The islands that have graced Wood Lake for decades aren't actually islands, but rather very large clumps of cattails. We had another bad storm in the fall of 2019. Before the new bridge was built, a combination of heavy winds and torrential rain that caused the lake level to rise and caused the cattails to let go of the lake bottom with their roots and float to the surface. The lake, where they were free to explore the lake and go where the breezes would take them. Shortly after the storm, I noticed from my 12th floor window that it seemed like some of the islands didn't seem to be in the same places that they were the day before. And the next day again, they had moved again. I had the idea of tracking their movement by setting up an old iPhone in my balcony window, and by using the time-lapse feature on it, I took pictures, was able to record each day's movements. Here are a few of my videos. You may note that each of them took about 10 hours to record because it would only click off a frame every 15 seconds or so. All of that in one day. And another day. Okay, start moving. And one more. Windy day. The lowering of the lake level continues to be a problem. Last fall, I took these next 3 or 4 photos in late October. I don't know if you remember, but we had very little rainfall in all of September and October last year, and the lake bottom started to emerge through the water, as you can see in these next few slides. So that's how sensitive the lake level is to climate. In May, 2 years ago, the city of Richfield announced that it had a budget of $24 million to rebuild the Nature Center, more than 15 million of which would be for new construction. If funding is secured at the state level, a robust public engagement calendar will be rolled out and to gather input and from the public and visitors to Wood Lake Nature Center. The engagement and design phase would last approximately 1 year, with construction beginning the following year. New buildings, museum space will have multi-purpose classrooms and special event spaces, animal displays, and raptor cages. The new building will occupy roughly the same footprint as the current building. There will be 100 to 120 parking spaces, some of which will have charging stations for electric vehicles. Here are a few architect renderings of what the new building might look like. So, as you can see, this is not the end, but a new beginning for our 52-year-old Wood Lake Nature Center. If you have any questions about my talk, I'd be happy to try to answer them. And if you appreciate the center and Wood Lake, please feel free to drop a few dollars in the donation box by the front door as you leave. Are there any questions?
Is there a natural outlet for the lake?
So the question is there a natural outlet for the lake?
Well, the pipes that were installed to carry it eventually to the river, that's the main outlet, yeah. Others?
Yes, that was so interesting. Thank you so much. This is not strictly Wood Lake related, but I just didn't know. Do you know why Augsburg College did not ever relocate to Richfield?
Why did Augsburg College not relocate to Richfield?
I don't really know the answer to that. There is an Augsburg Park not far from here. Others?
Right here?
Questions?
In early 1900s, my grandfather fished here. Said it was a great fishing lake. And he fished all over the Twin City area, Minnetonka and all over.
Yeah.
And then my dad bought 2 lots on Oak Grove Boulevard
Yep.
in 1938, and we moved into the new house in 1939. I went to Wood Lake School, which was on 66th Street.
Right.
And my kids grew up in Richfield. I had an ice boat on Wood Lake. I ice boated in the winter. I had a sailboat, and I sailed in the summer. And I also swam in the cove at the other end of the lake. And I could reach down, and my feet would be cold from the springs coming up from the bottom. But Wood Lake was a great place to open up and live.
Well, thank you for that information. I'd like to talk to you after the program if you would come and see me. Other questions? No? Well, thank you.
Thank you, Bob.